Densha de Go!
Densha de Go 64, or Go by Train 64, is a train simulation game developed by Taito and released in Japan on July 30th, 1999. The game is a port of the Japanese arcade cabinet known as Densha de Go 2 Kosoku-hen, or Go by Train 2 High Speed Edition, which released the previous year. Densha de Go is a very popular and long-running series in Japan, spanning more than 15 releases, with the most recent game being released on the PS4 and Nintendo Switch back in 2020. However, most likely since the game predominantly features Japanese train lines, it has never seen an official release outside of Japan, which is a real shame in my opinion, for reasons we'll get into a bit later. For now, let's just pop Densha de Go 64 into the old N64 and see what we're dealing with here. So, the first thing we're greeted with when starting up Densha de Go 64 is a very charming logo introduction for Taito, where the logo is dragged in and pushed away by a little train. This is honestly a really cute way to do a logo screen for a game, in my opinion. It reminds me a lot of the way Rare did their logo intros for games like Banjo-Kazooie, Diddy Kong Racing, and Donkey Kong Country, which I've always loved. It's all about that little extra bit of detail that really helps make a game special. But anyway, following the logo, we're treated to what may very well be the most 90s intro to a game that I've ever seen. I'll probably be using it as the intro to this video, so I'm sure you already know what I'm talking about. We get a few wackily edited images of real trains interspersed with some rad angles of actual gameplay, capped off with a salute from what appears to be a girl drawn by the game director's kid. All of this is set to an upbeat synthesized jingle that really drives home that whole 90s video game vibe. It's a bit crude in terms of game intros, but that doesn't mean I don't like it. In fact, I think it sets the mood rather well, and it also triggers the part in my brain dedicated to nostalgia for 90s media, which is always a great feeling. After the intro, we find ourselves at a still image of a real train and the title of the game that serves as this game's title screen. This is also the box art for Densha de Go 64. I would have said this is a rather underwhelming title screen if it wasn't for the fact that every time you boot up the game, you get to hear a guy yell,
Densha de Go!
When you get to this screen. For some reason, that just always puts a smile on my face. I know I'm a very simple man. Once we press start and hear a sound that can only be described as that 90s laser sound, we finally reach what is this game's main menu. From here we have 4 choices to choose from, namely Arcade Mode, Beginner's Mode, Game Setup, and Rankings. Let's go over these in reverse order, because I feel like that's the best way to approach this. Now, since this was originally an arcade title, it would make sense that rankings would be a rather big part of the game, and that's clearly true based on the fact that we have a whole section of the main menu devoted solely to them. But what exactly is it that we're ranking here? Well, this is a train simulation game, so players are ranked on how far they're able to travel without failing. We'll go over how this works in more detail later, but for now all you need to know is that the rankings mode just shows a leaderboard for each course in the game, with how far players manage to get as the basis for ranking. Next up is the game setup mode, and this is just your standard run-of-the-mill settings menu. You can change things like audio format, control style, difficulty, speedometer view, so on and so forth. But one aspect of the settings that we really need to talk about is the ability to change which controller you're using. Densha de Go as a series has always been about realism when it comes to controls, and that is manifested in specialized standalone controllers for almost all their home releases. These controllers are designed to be small versions of what a real train conductor would use when driving a Japanese train, and are very similar to what you'd see on the Densha de Go arcade cabinets. The controllers vary in design slightly from release to release, but usually we see an accelerator lever on the left and a brake lever on the right, with a few other buttons to help with stuff like menu navigation and various other minor things towards the bottom. At the time of release, this controller cost 6,380 yen, according to the very little information available about this peripheral online, which would have been around $55 US at the time of release. That's not necessarily a cheap investment for a controller that only works with a single game, but in my opinion it's totally worth it for the enhanced immersion and ease of control. The game was clearly built to be played on one of these controllers, so while it is possible to just use a regular N64 controller here, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a very smooth experience. Nowadays, the Densha de Go 64 controllers regularly go for upwards of $100 on aftermarket sites like eBay, so that has definitely raised the barrier of entry here, but personally I'm very satisfied with my purchase. Speaking of the Densha de Go 64 controller, I've done a whole video going over the history and inner workings of the device, so if you're interested in learning more about this oddity of a Nintendo peripheral, feel free to check out that video as well. Getting back on track here, the last setting we need to talk about is the final one on the list that allows us to enable voice recognition. Voice recognition in this game is made possible through the use of the Nintendo VRU, or Voice Recognition Unit, which I've also made a video on. The way this works is that you can call out things as a train conductor would when appropriate, which in turn gives you a reward of a few seconds of extra leeway time, which we'll get into in a moment, but essentially it makes the game easier and more immersive. Of course, the VRU is not a necessity by any means, and more often than not, I don't even use one when I play, because it's just too much of a hassle to set up every time you want to just run a few courses. It's also hard not to think about how odd I must look, sitting alone in my room with a VRU dangling around my neck, a Densha de Go 64 controller on my lap, yelling Japanese train signals. The novelty is definitely there, and I get the appeal, but it's not a big enough draw for me to use the VRU more than a few times with this game. Moving on, now let's talk about Beginner's Mode. And when we select Beginner's Mode, we see there are two options to choose from. The first is Learning Course, and the second is Practice Course. Let's start by going over the Learning Course. This is very simply the tutorial mode, as you might have guessed. You're taken through the steps of a normal train excursion from one stop to the next, which is definitely pretty helpful. The only downside here is the obvious fact that, like most of the things in this game, the tutorial is entirely in Japanese, so if you don't read Japanese, you're probably going to have some trouble. There are some pictures and graphics to help convey what the game wants you to do, so it's not a huge problem, but it's at least something to consider. As for Practice Course, it's a pretty straightforward mode. You choose from a few courses that the developers hand-picked, and play through them without the fear of failing. I wish they let you play all the tracks in this way, because the arcade-style gameplay of the main mode won't appeal to everyone, but it's honestly not a huge deal. And that's pretty much it for the Beginner's Mode. Now let's move on to the main attraction here, this game's most robust mode, Arcade Mode. Arcade Mode in Densha de Go 64 is basically exactly what you'd expect. You choose from 4 major Japanese regions, Hokuriku, Tohoku, Kanto, and Kansai, and then choose a specific rail line from these regions to attempt to run. There are a total of 16 lines to choose from, which is a pretty decent amount, especially when you consider that some of these lines can take upwards of 30 minutes to fully complete. That is, if you can manage to make it that far. Now seems like as good a time as any, so let's go over how you actually run a line in Densha de Go 64. So, to start off, you're always going to begin at a stopped position in one of Japan's major train stations. From here, you wait until the signal turns green, which I think means go, at which point you disengage the brake. Don't start accelerating just yet, because you have to wait for the compartment signal to turn yellow. Once that does actually happen, you can then begin your acceleration. If you accelerate too early, you'll receive a penalty to your held time, or leeway time as I like to call it. This time can be seen at the top middle of the screen. The way this leeway time works is multifaceted. You'll lose time for not only traffic violations like not obeying the speed limit and leaving the station too early, but also for each second you're late to a stop on your specific line. As you can see, based on the actually minuscule amount of leeway time provided to the player, this game is extremely strict. If you're late to a stop by a few seconds and miss a speed drop once, you're pretty much done for in Densha de Go 64. Some more difficult tracks will even take off 2 or 3 seconds from your leeway time per second you're late to a stop, so for those you really gotta focus on being on time. Now there's no penalty for being early to a stop, but if you manage to arrive exactly at the arrival time shown in the top left corner of the screen, you will get some extra time added back to your leeway time, which can be a real lifesaver if you manage to pull it off. Obviously this is much easier said than done, however. The easier courses in the game will give you an idea of what speed to aim for, but as the tracks get harder, it's pretty much left up to you to figure out how fast you have to go to reach your destination on time. As far as other HUD elements go, you've got your speed in the bottom left, your distance to the next station in the bottom right, your brake level in the top right, your acceleration level in the top left, and the current signal color towards the right middle of the screen. There are also situational elements like speed reduction notices and whistle notices that'll appear under the signal on the right of the screen. These are the type of notices that need to be obeyed, or else you'll be docked some leeway time. And of course, if you run out of extra time, you fail the course. Another way to lose time in Densha de Go 64 is to mess up your stopping distance. The game tells you exactly where you need to stop down to the centimeter, and if you're too far from that marker, you'll lose time. The range is 2 meters behind to 1 meter ahead, and anything outside of that range will cost you time when you get graded on your stop. Also, things like stopping and then speeding up again in a station and using the emergency brake will cost you time, so it's advised to avoid using such tactics. Ideally, you'll stop exactly where you need to within about 30 centimeters or so, at which point you'll actually get a few seconds of time back, which once again is nice, but extremely hard to pull off. If you manage to make your way through all of the stops and get to the end of the line, you'll be graded on your performance and the credits will roll. This may seem like a very difficult thing to do, and that is definitely true if you don't like using continues like me. The game essentially lets you keep going as long as you wish, so long as you keep pressing continue after each failure. Your time will be refilled, and you'll be put back at your last stop. This is a good way of counterbalancing the extreme difficulty here, but it also makes you feel like you're not actually accomplishing anything because you had to continue. At least for me, it feels like my accomplishment is diminished because I used to continue. This leads pretty well into what I'd like to talk about next, the difficulty of Densha de Go 64. Normally, I'm a person who enjoys a good challenge. I just beat Elden Ring the other day, and I enjoyed every minute of it. However, it's when the difficulty gets to a level that's just plain unfair to the player that I have an issue. Densha de Go 64 suffers from this unfair difficulty to a pretty high degree. Obviously, since the game was originally meant for arcades, it was designed in a way to eat up your coins, and that's never been a particularly fun way to design a game in my opinion. The amount of leeway time you have and how much you lose for very minor mistakes is just way too strict, plain and simple. I like the concept of having to get to stops on time and stop within a tight range, but you can't make it so that if I go over by 3 meters, I lose half my time. Maybe have something like that as the harder difficulty in the game and make the easier difficulty much more lenient. Or even better, just let the player pick how much leeway time they get and display that along with their rankings. I personally think about a minute of leeway time would be ideal, but we're lucky if we get half that. To this you may say, why not just continue then? And in my opinion, I shouldn't have to constantly continue just to play the game at a normal level. You shouldn't have to be an absolute master of a game just to finish the easiest course in the game with no continues. For a home release of an arcade title like this, the developers should have thought about what would be fun in a home setting and adjusted the game to that, not just directly poured over the extremely punishing arcade version. And don't even get me started on how annoying the speed limits are. You'll just be cruising along doing 100 kilometers per hour or more, and then out of nowhere you'll be slapped with a 45 kilometer per hour speed limit that you have to get down to in 2 seconds, or you'll lose like 10 seconds of your time. It's just insane. The only way you'll know something like that is coming is if you've already played the course, which is just asking too much. In Japanese, there's a term known as shoken goroshi, which refers to something designed to kill or cause you to fail on your first attempt with little to no means of avoidance. You just have to know it's coming to get around it, and that is exactly what we see here with the speed limits. It's a design philosophy I'm not too fond of when it's done in a way that only serves to make you fail on your first try. I'm fine with learning tactics and getting better at avoiding things, but when something is simple to avoid if you know it's coming, but actually impossible to avoid if you don't, that's where I have a problem. So, in terms of the difficulty of the game as a whole, it's very unforgiving. To a level where I'd say it's vastly too much. Which is a shame because the core mechanics of Densha de Go 64 are great. They are tons of fun. Who wouldn't love just chilling out, driving a train down a snowy track in Hokkaido, and seeing how well you can do it? It's an excellent concept for a relaxation game, which is marred by the extremely over-the-top difficulty. But okay, now let's talk about something I really liked about the game, the visuals and audio. In terms of the graphics, well, they're N64 graphics. Personally, I absolutely love them. There's just something about a low-poly sign that's so low-res you can barely read what it says, or a pixelated 2D sprite of a real person that doesn't move at all in the background that just makes me happy. I'm aware nostalgia plays a role in how I see this style of graphics, but I do think from an objective point of view they can be very appealing when done right. And even setting aside the artistic stuff for a moment, the technical feat of getting train lines this vast onto an N64 game is amazing. Seriously, these things are huge. It seems to have been done through loading in assets as you progress and unloading them as you pass them by, which is how games are typically made nowadays, but at the time this was cutting edge stuff. It would be really weird to have just a bunch of really short tracks, so I'm very happy they were able to make this work. Another thing I really like about this game's visuals are the great vistas that the player is often treated to while operating the train. There's vast areas of Japanese farmland, snowy forests, cityscapes at sunset. They're all gorgeous. It really makes it fun to just roll your way down the track, which is a big win for Densha de Go 64 in my opinion. Now, some of you may have noticed that I used the word audio just a few moments ago, and that was for good reason. Usually I just talk about the music of a game in this section, but Densha de Go 64 doesn't have any music while you're actually driving the train. The only things you can hear are the rhythmic noises of the wheels on the track, the voice of the conductor making announcements over the loudspeaker, and the occasional engaging and disengaging of the brake. It's generally a rather quiet experience, but that is actually a good thing in my opinion. The game does a great job of making you feel like you're actually on a train, and as we now know, immersion is one of the biggest things the developers aimed for, so this decision makes a lot of sense. However, that's not to say we don't have any music here. There's a menu theme, a credits theme, an intro, a theme for inputting your name, among others. And in my opinion, they're all really great pieces of music. Once again, the 90s flair that we don't often see used nowadays comes out in full force here, and I'm sure you realize by now I can't get enough of it. My personal favorite song here is probably the credits theme because it just has such a mellow atmosphere to it, which really accentuated the way I personally enjoy playing this game. Densha de Go 64 is a game that I personally consider to be one of the best hidden gems of the N64. The immersive nature of the gameplay makes for a very relaxing atmosphere. The visuals are very often absolutely breathtaking, especially for an N64 game, and the soundtrack is just classic 90s, which I love. However, there is the issue of unfair difficulty, which is a leftover from the game's arcade days. There are ways to circumvent this, especially if you don't care about using continues, so it's not really a huge deal, but personally it was a blemish on the experience. Overall, though, I do think this is a great game for just kicking back and relaxing every now and then, which is not super common for a game of this era. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the game is only available officially in Japanese, but there is a fan translation available online, which seems to be very well done. I wouldn't really recommend playing this game on PC because you won't be able to use the Densha de Go 64 controller, so personally I'd say go with a flash card if you have access to one, or just play the original. There really isn't too much that you can't figure out even with zero Japanese knowledge, so if you do choose to go with the original game, you should be fine. But anyway, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the review. It always means a lot to me. I know it's been a few weeks since I last posted a video, but we should be back on track starting today. Thanks for sticking with me. If you did happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out. I guess the developers really wanted you to put in a lot of training to get good at this game, huh? There's really just so much to keep track of. Maybe I'm just not conducting myself well enough, though. I love train puns.